My name is Ted Holt. I work for Profound Logic Software, and I'm here to talk about Atrium. To be more precise, I'm going to tell you how to load Atrium with your own menu data. In case you're not familiar with Atrium, I should explain that Atrium is a menuing system that is part of Profound UI. Just as IBM menus let users run their applications within a green screen environment, so Atrium lets users run their applications within a web browser. Atrium lets you define users and user groups. These are the people who use your system. It lets you define navigation items. These may be submenus or menu options that run applications. And Atrium lets you control access to navigation items by user and user group. You can learn more about Atrium by studying the documentation pages at profoundlogic.com/docs. In order for Atrium to perform all this magic for you, you have to give it a lot of data. You have to tell it who the users are, what programs are available to them, and which users are permitted to run which programs. That is a lot of data that somebody has to feed to the system. This brings me to something that I've been saying for years. I call it Holt's Law of Interactive Programming. And it says the problem with interactive programs is that you can't run them in batch. It's not really a law. An observation maybe, but law sounds good, so that's what I call it. Atrium has an interactive way for you to work with user, user group, navigation, and authorization data. And that's normally what you will use to maintain that data. But for the initial load, that's an awful lot of pointing, clicking, and keying. You can hire temporary workers to enter all that data. I've seen it done for other types of data. But the better way is to load the data in bulk, and that's what I'm going to show you how to do. Before I get into the mechanics of loading data, let me say something about terminology. IBM encourages us to use the same database terms that are in general use throughout the industry. Say schema, not library. Say table, not physical file. Say index and view, not logical file. Say column, not field. Say row, not record. That can get confusing, so what I try to do is to use the traditional terms when talking about objects that are created with CL commands, such as create physical file and create logical file. And I use industry standard terms when talking about objects that are created with SQL data definition language commands. Now let me tell you about the Atrium database. There are 4 salient points that you need to keep in mind. First, Atrium data is stored in physical files that begin with the letters AT and end with the letter P. You can learn more about these files in Profound Logic's documentation pages. profoundlogic.com/docs/display/PUI/Atrium+database. Loading Atrium is a matter of writing data into these files, and writing data into physical files is something you already do well. Second, the files have surrogate keys, not natural keys. That is, each user, user group, and navigation item is assigned a serial number as a unique identifier. We refer to these serial numbers as IDs. Any file that references a user group, or navigation item must use these ID numbers. As you load the data, you will need to generate the proper IDs. Third, physical file ATUIDSP controls the assignment of the IDs. It has 2 records. There's one record for users and user groups and another one for navigation items. ATUIDSP has 2 fields. AUI field is the key, and AUI next is the next ID to be assigned. As you add new users, groups, and navigation items, you will begin with the current values, and you will need to update the next ID for the appropriate type of data. Fourth, how you load the data is up to you. You may want to write RPG programs. I prefer to use SQL scripts. The load process is a one-shot task, and I don't believe in over-engineering. So thrown together, throwaway SQL code is adequate. Now let's talk about the load process itself. I recommend you begin with users and groups. Each user already has a user profile for the IBM system. Atrium requires a little more information. For instance, is this user an Atrium administrator, a manager, or a user? What banner, if any, does he see? What's his home page? You don't need to add all IBM users to Atrium, but you have to load the ones who will use Atrium. You should also consider assigning each user to a user group. If the users of your system are already assigned group profiles, you should probably define those groups to Atrium. The best reason for assigning users to groups is that you can control navigation item access by group. That is, instead of assigning access to a navigation item for each individual user, you assign access for a group, and all users in that group have access to the given navigation item. To load users and user groups, you will need to write into two physical files. AT groups P has a record for each user group. AT users P has a record for each user. You will also need to read and update AT UIDSP. The row for users and user groups has a key value of GRP USR ID. When you installed Atrium, the installation process created one group, administrators, and one user that is assigned to that group. If so, then AT Groups P has one record with an ID of 1, AT Users P has one record with an ID of 2, and the value of the GRP USR ID record in AT UIDSP is 3, indicating that the next group or user will be assigned an ID of 3. Begin by creating a temporary physical file of users. One good way to do that is to use the display user profile command to generate a physical file of all users. That will give you all the user profile names and their group profiles. It will also give you supplemental group profiles, which Atrium also supports. But I'm not going to cover supplemental group profiles today. You can load the Atrium files directly from the output of display user profile, but I prefer to load from a table with fewer columns. Here's the DDL to create such a table, which I call users 7. Loading my own table allows me, or more likely my customer, to tweak the data before I load the data into Atrium. We may want to change group profiles and text descriptions, or we might delete the records of people who will not be working with Atrium. I've used the display user profile command to build a temporary file of all users. Then I selected the user profiles and group profiles that I want to load into Atrium. Slightly more tweaking, and I can load the user 7 table. Now I'll show you a script that I have used to load Atrium users. You must generate the ID numbers of the users and groups. So the first step is to retrieve the next available ID value from the ATUIDSP file and store that value in variable vSequence. Next, load the groups by selecting all the distinct group names from user 7. The for loop is a shorthand version of a cursor. The insert occurs for each selected row. Note that the sequence number is incremented after each row is inserted. Then load the users. The insert runs for each individual user profile. The join to the AT groups file is necessary in order to tie each user to his group. Again, notice that the sequence number is incremented after each insert. Last, save the next available ID number in ATUID SP so that the creation of users and user groups will work properly in the future. This simple script is all you need to load users and user groups. This script and the others that I will share with you today require a two-step process. The first step is to run the script to create a stored procedure. Think of this as compiling the stored procedure, because that's what it is. DB2 writes a C program and compiles it. I use the run SQL statements command to execute these scripts. The second step is to call the stored procedure to load the users. There are two ways to call the stored procedure. One is to use the SQL call command within an interactive SQL session. The other is to use the run SQL command from a CL command line. I use an interactive session, preferably with run SQL scripts. Make sure your load programs or scripts find the objects in the proper libraries. I avoid qualifying object names, so I set the library list appropriately. Here are the affected files after I have called the load users stored procedure. Notice that the AG group field in AT groups P and the AU user field in AT users P have IDs ranging from 1 to 11. The ATUID SP file shows that the next user or group added will have an ID of 12. Notice that the AG group field for users contains the ID of the group to which they belong. That wasn't so hard, was it? If you want to load supplemental group profiles, you'll need to write to file ATSUP-GRPP. I don't have any code for you because I've never had to load that file, and I'm not one to cross my bridges before I get to them. Once you have the users loaded, turn your attention to the menus. Atrium calls menus and menu options navigation items. A navigation item can open a submenu or run an application such as a web application or an RPG program. Today I'll show you one way to load your IBMI menu options into Atrium. There are two ways to tell Atrium what to do. One way is to specify which menu options to take. For example, from the initial menu take option 4, then take option 7, then take option 3. In this demo I use the other approach. I tell Atrium to run a certain CL command, which is usually the call command. The Atrium file for navigation items is ATNAVP, ATNAVP. The text description for an option, that is what a user sees on an IBMI menu, goes in ATNAVP. I'm also using file ATNVARSP, ATNVARSP, the macro variables file, to store the command behind the menu options. I'll tell you more about this file in a minute. Each file has one row per navigation item. As with users, I create a table to hold the menu data. Here's an example called Menu 7. To illustrate the load, imagine that you work for a factory that makes two products, widgets and thingamajigs. You have a small application with 3 menus, each of which has 2 options. The first menu has options to load the other menus. I won't load that menu into Atrium because Atrium's Navigator pane handles that function. I only load the menu options that run programs. The other 2 menus run the application programs. There is a menu for widgets called Menu W and a menu for thingamajigs called Menu T. Each of these has an option for file maintenance and an option for reports. Here's the widgets menu. The thingamajigs menu is identical. Let's load the data. Here's the menu 7 table. I have defined 4 menu options, 2 each for widgets and thingamajigs. The description field is what the user sees when looking at the menu. The command field tells which program is behind each option. This is the same sort of information you give SDA when you define a native menu. Here's the script to load the Atrium files and a temporary cross-reference file, menu xref. Menu xref is not a part of Atrium. I use it to store navigation item IDs because I will need those IDs to grant access to the users. I'll tell you more about menu xref later. First, here are some variable declarations. Get rid of the old data if it exists. This part isn't necessary. I put it there when I had to reload the data. I deleted the navigation items from ATNavP and made this code delete everything associated with it. Retrieve the next available ID number for navigation items. Use a for loop to iterate over the menu data. Set the menu up as a navigation item. AUTHP is the authorities file. I tell Atrium that no menu has public authority. Unless I grant authority to a user, that user will not see this menu in the Atrium navigation pane. Save the assigned ID number to the menu xref file for loading authorities. Notice that the sequence number, ID, is incremented. Add an option to the menu. The first insert adds the ID to menu xref. The Genie macro I use to execute the navigation items has a substitution variable named command. The second insert stores the CL command behind this option as variable command in file ATInvarsP in the Atrium database. The third insert sets public authority for a navigation item. In this script, the public has no authority to any navigation items. Update the next available item number for future additions to the Atrium database. If you don't update ATUIDSP, you'll be in big trouble when you try to add a new navigation item someday. Here are the affected Atrium files with the loaded menu data. The navigation items, that is the menus and menu options, are defined with sequence numbers 101 through 106 in ATNavP. The commands behind the menu options are defined as Genie macro substitution variables in file AT-INVARS-P. The public is denied access to all navigation items by default. This is defined in file AT-AUTH-P. The next sequence number has been set to 107 in ATUIDSP. There are several ways to run an application from a navigation item. In this example, I used the Genie macro run command, which is described in the Profound Logic documentation. I stored the commands behind the menu options in variables in the AT-INVARS-P file. See the URL at the bottom of the screen for more information. profoundlogic.com/docs/display/PUI/Genie plus macros plus panel. The last step is to authorize the users to the navigation items. The users won't see the menus and menu items to which they are not authorized. Authorization is stored in file AT-AUTH-P. The load menus script added public authority to this file. The AAID field refers to a group ID or user ID. A value of 0 represents public authority. The navigation item is authorized to the user if the AA allow field has the value 1. This query shows that the public is excluded from the widgets and thingamajigs menus and the options under those menus. Now let's authorize the user groups to the menu options they should have. As with users and menus, I've created a table which I named AUTH7 to hold authorization data. Here's the data inside that table. I also need the menu xref file that I built when loading menus. It has the navigation item ID numbers that were assigned to each menu option. The menu itself has an option number of -1. Here's the script to load that data into Atrium. All authority is by user groups. Atrium allows you to authorize navigation items to individual users, of course, but I wouldn't go that route except in cases where group authority is insufficient, which I hope would be rare. The first insert authorizes the groups to the navigation items that execute programs. Think of these as the menu options behind a green screen menu. It's not enough to authorize access to the menu options. You also have to authorize access to the menus themselves. The second insert takes care of this requirement. This is what the data looks like after the load. Authorization has been defined for 3 groups. Group W, the users who deal with widgets. Group T, the users who deal with thingamajigs. Super V, the supervisors, who must deal with both product lines. It is as we would expect. The users in the thingamajigs group have access to the thingamajigs menu, the thingamajigs maintenance, and the thingamajigs reports, ID numbers 110, 111, and 112. The users in the widgets group have similar access to the widgets group and the widgets options, ID numbers 108, 109, and 110. The supervisors have it all. When the users sign on, Atrium dynamically loads the navigation items to which a user is authorized. Alice Aardvark, being a supervisor, has the widgets menu and the thingamajigs menu. Bob Badger only has access to widgets. Earl Emu has access to thingamajigs. Chances are that your first load won't be successful. You may very well find that you did not load a column that should have been loaded, and you need to tweak your script. It's okay. Reloading is no big deal, especially if no one has loaded anything else by hand. Before reloading, delete the data that you're going to replace. I usually do this with plain old interactive SQL. The version I usually use is Run SQL Scripts in IBM Access Client Solutions, or ACS for short. These are the steps. The reset sequence store procedure resets the next ID number in the ATUIDSP file. Here's the source code for that. You don't have to reset the sequence numbers. I do it for safety. It ensures that the reload will not attempt to use sequence numbers that are active in the database. Thank you for your attention. I hope this video is helpful to you. If you want the scripts or a transcript of this presentation, send a request to support@profoundlogic.com and they'll send them to you.